So welcome everyone. Let's kick things off. Today's webinar, SMSF Pension Planning Toolkit. Look, what I want to speak to you all about today is really a bit of a, I've called it toolkit, but the point of what I'm trying to achieve here is say there's a lot of issues that we need to contemplate with regards to paying pensions from self-managed superannuation funds, and so we need to make sure that when we're addressing these issues with our clients, that we're actually covering off on all of the critical issues that we need them to understand with reference to not just the commencement side of the pension, but also the ongoing implications, and then ultimately the estate planning side of things. So what I'm really trying to get out of today's session for everybody is ultimately that top point there, that there is no one size fits all model for self-managed super fund pensions. Yes, we are largely operating in an existence of account-based pensions. There are still legacy pensions, which really won't be the topic for today, but we still have those legacy pensions that exist. But primarily for our account-based pensions, what decisions are we going to make? What is the impact of the decisions that we make? So what are the ramifications potentially from a taxation point of view, from a social security point of view, that we need to think about when going through the decision-making process with our clients. I will touch briefly on issues like the importance of documentation and cover off on, I guess, what I think are the key documents that you need with reference to your pension commencements. And that as well, and references obviously within the deed as well. And probably the last bit that I will touch on, the last bit that I will touch on through the session is the concept of reversionary versus discretionary pensions, because it's always a sort of a hot subject matter, and many of you will know that I talk a lot about I talk a lot about the concept of discretionary versus reversionary, and I tend to favour quite publicly discretionary pensions, but that's not for any reason other than that I feel that they give you exactly the same flexibility, just with some other reporting issues associated with them. So, I guess I want to address my point of view there and highlight that I'm 100% behind reversionary pensions as much as discretionary pensions, but just so that people can differentiate between the two. So we'll talk through, I guess, the considerations that I see the most significant, which is transition to retirement income stream, the use of multiple pensions, running multiple pensions versus having a single pension strategy. And again, it's not right or wrong for one or the other. It's just really working through the various flexibilities associated with running potentially multiple pensions versus the other. Drawing lump sum benefits versus taking pension payments, and the ramifications of one versus the other from a client point of view. And then, as I said, that whole reversionary versus non-reversionary. So throughout that, the subject will tend to lean towards the taxation and social security issues associated with the various decisions that you make, without necessarily being quite specific about one or the other. But what I will say is that I have provided some ATO statistics in here about average member balances, and the fact that that 94%, I think, is the number of SMSF members have less than $1.6 million in their superannuation fund. And so the reality is that many self-managed super fund members, once they hit age 67, will be eligible in some way, shape or form for some social security benefits, whether it be age pension, whether it be Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. And I think that actually has to come into the decision-making process. And, we see interest rates raising again. So what does that mean? What are the ramifications there on things such as deeming rates? I know that there's a bit of a freeze on deeming at the moment, but how long does that freeze stay in place from an age pension and often the income testing point of view? So these are all the sorts of things that we need to contemplate when discussing our pensions, and so therefore we need to put together our pension toolkit to have ourselves ready and armed when we're having the discussions, both at commencement and an ongoing basis with our clients. So if we look first at the pension life cycle, it really starts with that concept of transition to retirement. And I will focus briefly in a moment on transition to retirement pensions as being the first point of call as such for paying pensions from a self-managed superannuation fund. We'll talk a little bit about, the popularity of them, the reasons behind whilst that popularity has spiked and then potentially dipped as well, but appreciating that they are the first real instance of where we can commence pensions inside an SMSF. Then we'll talk about or we'll incorporate the retirement phase income streams as well. So, the cycle takes us through transitioning to retirement, and then ultimately the payment of death benefit income streams. But of course, what we now need to consider, largely since 2017, is that sitting alongside a lot of our pension interest now is this accumulation interest. And I think this is only going to be highlighted more with the capacity from 1 July for people to make contributions right up until their 75th birthday. Now, if we're starting pensions as young as potentially 60, but let's say 65, for sake of the argument, if we're starting pensions there, then there's this 10-year sort of window of pensions and contributions operating side by side. So when we look at the pension life cycle, we really have to factor in that people will potentially have these accumulation interests if you contemplate downsizer contributions as well. So what are people doing with that additional money? Are they putting it into pension? Have they reached their transfer balance cap? Where are they going to draw from? All of these are the relevant questions that form part of, I guess, this package that we need to be able to present to our clients in this space. So the life cycle has certainly changed over the last 2 decades of SMSFs and their existence. So the questions that I tend to raise as far as the toolkit is concerned is generally, and these are the questions that I'll pose as questions today. I won't be providing solutions necessarily, or providing sort of examples that can lead you to your own solutions for your clients. But these are the questions that I think we have to actually address, and we'll come back and revisit them at the end of the session as well. But they're important to understand. Okay, where do my clients sit in regards to these various options? So the first one is, transition to retirement income stream. What is their relevance post 1 July 2017? Multiple pensions, what roles do they have to play? Should withdrawals be treated as pension withdrawals or lump sum withdrawals? So again, they're very sort of generic questions, but circumstances will dictate whether you even contemplate these questions or whether you just move on to the next one. And then the estate planning side of things. So estate planning is one of those key issues that I talk to people about right from the moment they set their fund up. Have they got a will? Have they got an enduring power of attorney? What sort of circumstances have they prepared their fund for the inevitable event that they as members will pass away? And whilst it's an area that we don't necessarily like to address all the time, particularly when we get to pension phase, we need to be addressing what the ramifications of the member passing away are, but also, by extension of that, what are the ramifications of other events happening prior to them passing away? So if they separate after paying a pension, what does that mean with regards to the terms of the pension that they set up when they were as part of a couple? What if they form a new relationship once they've started a pension? All these sorts of things need to be taken into consideration. And then the overarching question, so what all of these questions generally lead to is what impact do these decisions have on the taxation liabilities, not just of the individual, but the tax liability of the fund, the tax liability of the members' beneficiaries. So if there is adult children to receive benefits, if there is younger children to potentially receive benefits, and then what are the social security issues associated with all of these decisions as well. So, there's a lot for us to pack in to this hour, and there's a lot for you to then go away and contemplate with your clients. And as I said, really what I'm providing is a bit of a teaser to all of those issues that we need to contemplate for the sake of our clients. But as always, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And I'll endeavour to answer them as we go through the presentation, and then provide a summary of those following the presentation. So one of the key things that we have to talk about with regards to paying pensions from a super fund is the supporting documentation that is incorporated into paying a pension for a fund. So that obviously is always going to be addressed by saying, what do the governing rules say? So what does the trust deed say with regards to the pension fund? Now, again, you'll all have clients that have been around for varying periods of time. Some of those would be funds that have been set up since 2017, some in the period between 2007 and 2017, and then you would have pre-2007 clients, and what process have they undertaken to update their trust deed in that time frame? Have they regularly kept it up to date? Have they still got a deed that sort of time frame is in and around that 2006, 2007 period as we were going through a large amount of superannuation reform? What does their deed say? What does it provide for? And does it actually provide them with the capacity to pay a pension? Now, most pension deed or most trust deeds are going to be generic enough to provide for the capacity to pay a pension in accordance with the law. But then, how specific does the deed get with regards to the introduction of things such as pension contracts, pension agreements, binding nominations, all those sorts of other elements that can actually impact the decisions you make with your clients? So really having a good understanding of the terms is an important issue. When I talk about the terms then, and something that became relatively popular or far more popular sort of with the advent of binding death benefit nominations and the concepts of superannuation wills, was the whole idea of a pension agreement. So, I won't say long gone are the days of single page pension files and pension commencement documentation, because, in its very sort of rudimentary form, you still see a lot of, I wish to start a pension, trustees acknowledge the request, and the pension is commenced on this date. So you still see a lot of simplistic pension commencement documentation out there. But generally, it's actually much better, in my opinion, if you've got sort of far more thorough pension terms or pension agreement, pension contract for whatever terms you want to apply to it, that dictate, the capacity of whether you can change the reversionary nature of the pension or not, whether you can take commutations as a lump sum, what the varying rules are. So, the law is relatively small or in regards of what it provides for. It sort of says, it can only revert to a certain number of people. You've got to draw a minimum to meet your pension standards. You can't use the capital for security for borrowing purposes. So it's relatively restrictive what the legislation provides for. And so it's actually going to be the terms that you set either via the deed or through a pension agreement that allow you to effectively pad out the rules around any pension that you're going to put in place. So I think it's important as we evolve that our documentation evolves. Similarly with the fund's investment strategy, what considerations are being provided for by the clients that ensure that the fund is going to meet its ongoing pension obligations or pension liabilities. Now, we know that we have to pay a minimum. We know at the moment that minimum has that 50% reduction in place, which makes it easier to meet the pension obligation. But it's not an uncommon question to hear that the fund doesn't have sufficient liquidity coming into 30 June, which we are fast approaching, where we're not going to be able to meet the pension obligation. Now, that is fundamentally an investment strategy concept, because the fund has to, on an ongoing basis, and they must regularly review it, they must undertake the process of ensuring that the fund can meet its liabilities, that it has the sufficient liquidity to meet its debts. So, there's a real key focus for me on that review point of the fund's investment strategy, not only at commencement, but on an ongoing basis. And particularly if we jump out of this 50% discount, all right, if we jump out of that, let's say at the end of 2023 financial year, then do we have sufficient liquidity to meet the income requirements of that following year, where we effectively double what we're having to draw down on? So all of those things are significant issues in regards to the whole pension planning toolkit, is that not only are we contemplating the rules around the pension, but we're also reviewing our other documentation, be it the fund's investment strategy, existing binding death benefit nominations, whatever the case might actually be, to make sure that all of the documentation and all the decisions actually sit in line with what the trustees and ultimately the beneficiaries and members want to achieve. And one of the common questions that we all get asked is, which takes precedence, a reversionary pension or a binding death benefit nomination? And you'll get multiple answers depending on who asks who you ask. But the same answer is given to this question by all parties out there. And it's like, well, make sure all of the documentation leads to the same position, right? And then you can have reversionary pensions sitting alongside binding death benefit nominations, right? So as long as everything points in the same direction, even if it is multifaceted, multi-tiered, then as long as everything says the same and the pension agreements or whatever support that, then it's a moot point as to which comes first, the binding death benefit nomination or the reversionary pension, because they're leading to the same outcome. So it's important to review these things as we go along. As I've touched on a couple of times already, Centrelink is a pretty key issue, particularly if we look at the fact that whilst we don't tend to focus a lot on it in the SMSF space, it's clearly a space that we can be focusing on a lot more because of the size of the balances members have and potentially the income that they draw down on those account balances of less than $1.6 million, meaning that they would qualify for, say, the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. So what are the existing or potential future pension Centrelink opportunities that can avail themselves to the clients? Do they have a 2000 or a pre-2015 pension, account-based pension, and what does that mean from the deeming considerations versus the old deductible amount rules, you know, and what are the ramifications of taking lump sums from those pensions versus income payments? So they're the sorts of relevant scenarios we have to deal with, and of course those existing legacy pensions from pre-2006 and 2007 with your 100% and 50% asset test exemption. What is the impact of having those inside the fund? Because they still exist and they're problematic administratively, but they're providing a benefit that a lot of clients most certainly don't want to get rid of. And so we have to manage their expectations around reserves and other things as well. And a lot of this comes back to this tax ruling 2013-5 of when a pension commences and ceases. And to me, I won't dwell on this. I've dwelled on this ruling for a long time now. But ultimately, I think it covers off on a number of key points that we can use in our conversation about when that pension commences. And one of the key things that comes out of that is obviously the whole concept of not backdating pension commencement. So having trustees make a decision and then apply that decision, even if the documentation follows suit and takes some time because the fund must be reconciled and it might have some outstanding lodgements, which mean the balances aren't correct. But if a decision is made that they wish to commence a pension, and this is why I'm doing this in June, because for those that are looking for a 1 July pension commencement date, now's the time to make that decision. Right, we're now in June, and if the clients can come out and say, we wish to commence a pension on the 1st of July, well then yes, it's going to take, you know, a quarter, potentially 2 quarters to reconcile that fund to 30 June to get the numbers to be able to actually finalise the minimum pension obligation, but at least the request has been made. And that's what this ruling provided for, is when does a pension commence, but equally when that pension ceases. And so it's good to have that appreciation, and the introduction of the term auto reversionary was really first came about from this ruling, despite the fact that reversionary pensions existed before it. But this is where the tax office first alluded to, you know, if the pension automatically reverts, then it doesn't cease on death. And that was largely at the time back in 2013 about the exempt current pension income deduction and a continuation. Now that issue in itself now is not as significant, because the exempt current pension income deduction continues on until, as soon as practically, until the death benefit commences to be paid. So if your pension is not reversionary, you still have a continuation of that ECPI if you take a little bit of time, albeit, you know, marginal, not years or anything like that, but if you take time to make the appropriate decision, then the deduction will follow suit. So a lot of those issues are focuses of that ruling and beneficial for us moving forward to understand with the clients. So let's jump straight into a number of the key issues that I want to address through this. And I'll address them by using, I guess, providing some strategic opportunities, but also then providing some, I guess, overhead examples and case studies that we can then explore, and you can explore later, and I'll certainly be exploring sort of in the future, not so much in a 1 hour webinar, but to give, you know, thought to the process behind the various decisions. So TRIS, transition to retirement, it is a moving beast, and one thing that we need to be mindful of is that those who turn 58 in the 21-22 financial year, then in the next 12 months, starting from the 1st of July, so anyone born 1 July 1963 is going to turn 59 in a month's time, or just under a month's time. So they will have hit preservation age. So once they hit preservation age, they then sit in that should we or shouldn't we start a transition to retirement pension. And of course, one of the key things for me when it comes to transition to retirement income streams is clearly the accessibility of income. And whilst we have our non-assessable, non-exempt income for those aged 60 and above, then it may not be that attractive to start the pension at 59, albeit that it might be attractive to start the pension at 59 if you're going to turn 60 during the financial year and can draw down the income after the 60th birthday to ensure that that income is non-assessable. But if you want to ensure that the fund is not A, paying tax on its earnings, and B, the member paying tax on the income, you might want to look at the timing of the commencement of a transition to retirement income stream. But what we do know, and probably one of the catalysts for why TRISs became unpopular, was that only once someone hits retirement phase does a fund get the entitlement to the exempt current pension income deduction. So we had the introduction of the transfer balance cap, which now sits at the general transfer balance cap at 1.7 million, meaning that anyone that put up to 1.7 million in a retirement phase income stream would get an exemption on the fund earnings, but also would then get the tax exemption on their own earnings as well. So a TRIS, if we take someone who is not at retirement stage, they can actually set up a transition to retirement income stream with an unlimited account balance. So if they've got more than that 1.7 million, they can start the TRIS. It will be effectively a TRIS in accumulation. If they're over the age of 60, then they're going to get that non-assessable, non-exempt income themselves, but the fund will be paying tax on its earnings. Then what occurs is when they meet a condition of release, and we've got 65, retirement, permanently incapacitated and terminally ill, if they meet that condition of release, then that pension will go into a pension in the retirement phase, or a TRIS in retirement phase, and will be subject to the transfer balance cap. So if we kick off a pension, let's say someone starts a pension for $2 million in TRIS in accumulation, then at the time that they retire, they need to commute part of that back to accumulation to get it back down to the general transfer balance cap that will become their personal transfer balance cap at that point in time. But from that point, from that trigger, they will get the ECPI, and they'll also get the non-exempt, non-assessable, non-exempt income for themselves. So those four triggers are important to understand, particularly 65, because at 65, it's an automatic conversion. And so if you start with more than the 1.7, or the fund balance has grown up beyond that 1.7, then you need to be smart to act prior to the 65th birthday to make that commutation prior to bring it back down to the general transfer balance cap. The other events are notification-based events. So, the member is going to make that declaration of retirement. So as they're making that declaration of retirement, part of the checklist, part of the toolkit is to say, right, what's the current balance? Right, before we declare retirement, we need to make sure that the balance is back down to the general transfer balance cap to ensure that we can commence a pension in the retirement phase that is not going to be an excess transfer balance amount. And of course, the other condition that moves a pension from accumulation phase to retirement phase is a reversionary TRIS. So we can set up a transition to retirement in accumulation. We can make that pension reversionary, and then the death of the primary pensioner will trigger that pension moving into retirement phase. So the spouse themselves will then have a retirement phase income stream. Again, we need to be subject to the whole transfer balance cap consideration at that point in time. So TRIS is one of those scenarios where, when the exempt earnings disappeared for the fund from 1 July 2017, a lot of people triggered that or considered that as a bit of a negative and stopped utilising TRIS from a strategic point of view. To me, what that actually did was it returned TRIS to its position of where it should have been right back from 2006, which was as something that supplemented people's income as they were transitioning to retirement. So we got to a stage where strategically people were using a TRIS to take lump sums out and make elections to have those amounts treated as a lump sum withdrawal rather than a pension withdrawal, which was never the intention of TRIS. And so we took the strategy too far, or some people took the strategy too far, and I think the government recognised that, the tax office certainly recognised that, and they made the appropriate changes. But that's the past now. I think we still have lots of opportunities to contemplate. The first one is the tax relief on the income stream on withdrawals for non-assessable, non-exempt income if the member is 60 and over. Salary sacrifice and concessional cap. Now I've put $27,500 there being the current cap, but this is one of those things where if we've got a client who is in a higher tax bracket potentially, they can look to salary sacrifice. So they might be having their 10.5%. Yes, that's not going to give them a huge window necessarily, but they can sacrifice down, and they can supplement that sacrificed income with non-assessable, non-exempt income in the fund. So there is always going to be a tax saving in that environment for the client. Same with personal deductible. But if you take it a step further, for those with less than $500,000 in their fund, then they might be able to salary sacrifice a larger amount in a year as they are transitioning to retirement to use that carry forward concessional and offset a significant amount of their personal tax liability. So to me, the use of TRIS means you can still generate the income while providing a better tax benefit for yourself. And then the other side of it is this whole concept of proportioning benefits and creating multiple pension interests, because multiple pension interests are, to me, the catalyst of solid estate planning in the SMSF space, where you've got blended families or just multiple beneficiaries who you want to leave different components of your super benefits to. And so the whole point of talking about TRIS and multiple pension interests together is because we have an appreciation that you can only have one accumulation account in a self-managed superannuation fund, but you can have multiple pension interests. So you can run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, doesn't matter what the number is, pensions inside the fund, and they will be dictated by the amount that you place in them when you start. Now, we know that when you commence a pension from your existing balance, then whatever the proportion of tax-free and taxable money is will flow through to the pension commencement, and then that will flow through to the way earnings are allocated, benefits are paid, and ultimately death benefits are paid. But if we get strategic about multiple pension interests and we get strategic about transition to retirement income, it means that from an estate planning point of view, we can actually start to set up separate pensions based around the timing of contributions, particularly as we look at the whole contribution window extending up to 75. So a TRIS might be the perfect opportunity to lock in the taxable component of the fund into one pension, and then whether we're making non-concessional contributions or entering into recontribution strategies or making downsizer contributions, then they would be locked in under strategy number 2 or pension number 2, pension number 3, pension number 4, go on and on and on. Now, again, how many is too many? How long's a piece of string? It's one of those situations where if you're setting up multiple tax-free pensions, then you may look to do a commute and repurchase of those pensions just because they maintain the existing tax-free amount. But you want to make sure that at no point in time when you're doing that, do you have taxable component or taxable money sitting in the accumulation interest. So it all comes down to the various strategies that you need to consider when you're looking at running multiple pensions from an estate planning point of view. But also a flow on from that is failing the pension standard. Now this, it's one of those, we shouldn't be necessarily putting strategies in place in the event that the trustees and members do the wrong thing, but sometimes we do need to protect the members against their own inactivity or whatever it might be with regards to paying pensions. Now, I suspect that everybody online has at some point in time had a client that wants to start a pension, but then says, I don't need the minimum, or I don't need the income, I'm just doing it to draw down or to obtain the tax benefit in the fund. Now, of course, the contribution rules changing provide a great strategy for those clients because subject to transfer, the total super balance, they potentially have the capacity to recontribute that money in. But for those that choose not to draw down or draw down late, and then circumstances dictate that they haven't drawn enough for the year, then having multiple pensions, where we've gone through the process of trying to identify separate pensions for estate planning purposes, gives us the capacity to say, okay, well, what we want to do is we're going to fail. The pension's going to fail because we haven't paid the minimum, but we've paid a certain amount. So let's make sure that the 100% tax-free pension
is paid in full, and then the taxable pension, or the one with the highest taxable percentage, is the one that has to be commuted and recommenced, and therefore we're not actually losing that segregated 100% tax-free pension. So failing the pension standards, whilst it shouldn't be top of mind, we should all appreciate that it happens, and therefore having that multiple pensions is one way of creating a potential not lose-lose situation, but win-lose situation for the fund as such. And then the last one is a little bit linked to that as well, but the concept of capital preservation, starting a new pension versus commute and repurchase. Now, this is one of those areas where, if you look at the history of administration, you look back to 2007, where the rules changed and all pensions became non-assessable, non-exempt after age 60, then there was this attractiveness to just say, well, let's put more contributions in and then start another pension. But to keep it simple, let's stop the existing pension, start a new one, just so we're always running with one pension. Now, of course, what that triggered was an understanding or a requirement to understand the commutation rules, which again are expelled or expanded upon in the tax rule in 2013-5, whereby if you fully commute a pension, you're required to make a pro rata pension payment for that year. If we look at that and we extrapolate that out and we say, okay, we're going to make another contribution to a fund, right, then if we have been paying our pension along the way, right, what's the value of that pension doing at the same time? Because if the fund is in growth mode, then the capital behind that pension may have increased over the period of the year that we're talking about. So if you then make a contribution and you commute your existing pension and start one single pension, you may end up putting more capital, or you'll definitely put more capital in because of the contribution, but more capital than you had at 1 July. And so you're recalculating on a new amount and effectively paying on that higher balance. Just starting the new pension and just doing a pro rata minimum calculation on that contribution amount for the rest of the financial year, and knowing that the other pension is going to take care of itself. So it's a little bit about capital preservation there, because in a growth environment or an environment where clients have taken a larger portion of their pension out earlier in the year, then they're going to drain capital by starting effectively a commute and repurchase strategy in that event. So I wanted to address these sorts of strategies with a little bit of an understanding of the information that we have at our fingertips from the tax office. And the SMSF statistical overview that the ATO provided for the 19-20 year is our most recent information. And that provides, for me, I guess, some pretty good insight into drawing out the concept behind case studies, which is representative of a significant portion of our client bases. So the average and median age for self-managed super fund members is 61, right? So that in itself is a good point, because one, we know that we're in the non-assessable, non-exempt income age bracket. We know that we're past preservation age, or even past preservation age of those who were born after 1964, where preservation will be age 60. So that is a great strategic age. And we also know that after 1 July this year, we're then in downsizer contribution territory as well. So having the average and median age at 61 is strategically, a really, really beneficial age for us to be able to draw out on some of these concepts and how they work. The average accumulation balance, or those with no retirement phase benefits in their super fund, the average is 431,000 and the median is 213,000. So again, that 431,000 is a pretty important number to understand, because one, that triggers us for the capacity and accumulation to potentially use the carry forward concessional contributions. Clearly, it's giving us a lot of scope from a non-concessional contribution limit as to what we can do there. But it's just giving us, an ample amount of information to say, okay, here are all the strategies that are available for our clients who are in that median/average example. Member balances, so take out the whole the accumulation only side and take it and portion it across the entirety of the SMSF industry. We've got an average balance of 695,000 and a median balance of 414. So what that then represents is, it says that of the million plus SMSF trustees out there, we know that over half of them Because if the median point is someone sitting right in the middle, then over half of those trustees have a balance of less than $500,000. Right, so therefore they will sit comfortably in that carry forward concessional contribution market as well. So this is also inclusive of some of our existing account-based pension clients. So that's all pretty positive information. And as I quoted earlier, probably the interesting one to me is that 94% of SMSF members have a balance of less than $1.6 million. So that would automatically suggest that they are entitled to make non-concessional contributions, because that's measured against the 1.7 cap. And of course, as that cap indexes, that's just going to expand the capacity for people to make non-concessional contribution. And 2021 to me was probably a little bit of an outlier. We got the transfer balance cap, the general transfer balance cap, and the concessional cap indexed together in that year. I suspect, totally speculation here, so please don't hold me to this in the future when I'm proven totally wrong, but I suspect the general transfer balance cap will index well and truly prior to the concessional cap next time, because as we know, CPI indexation is the flavour of the month at the moment. Inflation's high, which means that the general transfer balance cap measured against CPI versus the average weekly ordinary times earnings rate, which is the measuring stick for concessional contributions, one's growing at a lot faster pace than the other. So we're going to get this anomaly where the general transfer balance cap and the concessional cap don't get indexed together in the future, and that's going to muck around with our capacity to make non-concessionals, but also what the value of the bring forward amount is, which is representative of 3 times the annual cap, which is 4 times the concessional cap. So all of those sorts of things are fairly relevant in where we move forward. So let's have a look at Tony, who has adapted, or is the age 61, so is an average SMSF person with an average SMSF member balance for somebody in accumulation. Tony's on his second marriage, has adult children from the first marriage. So this again is not as uncommon a scenario as we probably saw when self-managed super funds were just a small proportion of our industry, representative of over 20 years ago. We know that the world has changed fairly significantly in that time frame. Has the capacity to make a $330,000 contribution. Now, this could very well be that Tony has just sold his house and therefore from 1 July will qualify for the downsizer contribution. It could be that Tony has come into some form of benefit from an estate, from a family member passing away or something else. But we've got this capacity to make a $330,000 contribution. So what that looks like for me is, if we go back to the issues around transition to retirement income stream and multiple pensions, then we say, okay, well, from a tax relief point of view, Tony's over 60, so it's going to be non-assessable, non-exempt income. So there's a big tick in the idea of starting a transition to retirement income stream, even with that $431,000. Salary sacrifice, personal deductible. Again, the account balance is below $500,000. So does Tony have the capacity to actually contribute all of that money to super to offset his personal tax liability and utilise what he hasn't contributed over the last few years, and then put that in on top of the 431 from a superannuation point of view? But then if you then extend that out a little bit further, do you make that concessional contribution based on having less than 500,000, start pension number 1 and have that entire taxable component pension locked away, then make your $330,000 non-concessional contribution and start pension number 2. So you've got 2 transition to retirement income streams, one that's 100% taxable and one that's 100% tax-free. So when you look at that, you can then go back and commute pension number 1 if you wish to, the taxable one, to make further contributions in. But by locking in that 330,000, it's going to be 100% tax-free right up until the death benefit is paid. So that means, from an estate planning point of view, we can contemplate reverting pension 1 to the new spouse and make a binding death benefit nomination of P2, pension 2, to the children from the first marriage. And so then we've taken a situation where that 330,000 is then not subject to tax from an estate planning point of view, and we're saving in excess of $50,000 tax, which is our 15% plus Medicare on $300,000 from a death benefit lump sum to adult children. So, it's a huge tax saving
that can come out of this versus making the $330,000 contribution, having it all sit there with the additional 431, even if we don't make the concessional, then putting them together to start a pension, having $760,000, and having it roughly, in very simple terms, 60% taxable, 40% tax-free, and then trying to do a binding nomination where we leave 50% to our spouse and 50% to the children. Well, 50% to the children is then going to be 60-40 taxable, tax-free. And so by going down that multiple pension path, we've at least alleviated that tax liability for the children. From a pension standard point of view, if we didn't draw enough money from either of the pensions for the year, then we can draw enough from P2, the tax-free pension, and we can fail on P1. So whether it's transition to retirement income stream, we really don't want to fail on a transition to retirement income stream, because then those benefits will be treated as lump sum withdrawals and you've got payment standard issues associated with that. But if we move into our retirement phase, then yes, we'll lose the exempt current pension income associated with a portion of the fund's earning, but not the entirety of the fund's earnings. And I think that's a fairly sort of critical takeaway point from it, is that we have the capacity to keep the benefits in as tax-friendly an environment as we possibly can when things go bad. And then again, from a capital preservation, if we did a commute and repurchase, so the $330,000 coming in throughout the year, if we do a commute and repurchase, then if the investments have gone up in that time frame, then we're going to be adding additional capital to the 430,000 plus the 330, and then drawing a pro rata minimum, versus starting a second pension for just that 330, paying the minimum on the first pension based on what we calculated back on 1 July or its start date, and then paying a pro rata on the second pension from on the $330,000. Now, one of the key points that I raise whenever talking about commutations, and particularly full commutations, is that we've got to recognise and understand that 1 July commutations are administratively terrible, because you're actually having to do 1 day's pension, because the commutation is not time specific. So if you commute your pension on the 1st of July, you have to pay 1 day's pension. So you're better off going down the path of commuting it late in the year, 30 June, for example, and then commence the new pensions on the 1st of July, because again, from an ECPI point of view, it's going to have very minimal, if any, impact on the tax exemption for the prior year. And then you've got the no requirement to take any sort of fiddly little commutation or pro rata amount for that period up until the time of commutation. So strategically, I highlight just those 6 points there, and we could spend hours sort of extrapolating on each of those issues and providing examples on how that works. But it's really just to get each thought process into the mindset where particularly the tax relief, so the non-assessable, non-exempt income from age 60, is a real positive from a TRIS point of view, and then utilising the TRIS to draw down some income, remembering that you can draw down up to 10% of the balance. So if you're drawing down 10%, in this instance, even if we're talking purely about the $431,000, then Tony can draw out $43,000 from the fund as an income tax-free. Now, even if he's only carrying forward or bring forward 1 year's worth of concessional contributions, then can make a $50,000 tax deduction and offset their personal tax liability. So there is certainly scope to save a lot of tax in that issue. But for me, the multiple interests and proportioning between a tax-free and taxable, which you can't do once you've got merged all your money in accumulation, just has that additional flow on estate planning benefit. But it also leads to, and the whole commute and repurchase piece leads on to the concept of lump sums versus pension withdrawals. And this is effectively an administrative nicety. And, we talk about it, and where this largely exists is, to me, is that 6%. So we talked about the 94% who have less than $1.6 million, right? Those that have more than $1.6 million, then the whole concept of lump sum versus pension is a very relevant piece to be discussing. But then what portion of that 94% have enough when combined with their spouse will mean that the combined value is greater than the general transfer balance cap. Because if we look at reversionary pensions or even just normal death benefit income streams, and we've got a combined value of more than the general transfer balance cap or more than the personal transfer balance cap, then we need to work out, how do we, one, leave all that money in super, or two, do we want to leave all that money in super? But the use of lump sums versus pensions is certainly a way to help manage not just the general transfer balance, the personal transfer balance cap, but it's also a way of managing potentially the exempt current pension income of the fund and making scope for future contributions. So, we've got potentially the opportunity for downsize at a future date. And so if we can make space by taking a lump sum, then we could not only put that in our fund, but we can put it into a fund and put it into an account-based pension and get the exempt earnings on it there. So it is about retirement versus accumulation phase, and therefore it is about where we take the money from. But it's as much about estate planning as it is about ECPI within the fund. So as much as we tend to focus on the estate planning side of things with lump sum and pensions and how much money we can leave in at a later point in time, it's also about the tax liability of the fund in the current year. What outcome is going to give us the best position now, and what's more important to us, the future or the current day? Now, of course, for most people, the answer will actually be the future in regards to how much money they potentially want to leave in super. But the reality is, because we don't know what time or what point in time we're going to pass away, it's pretty critical to get the best set of circumstances you can in the current day environment. So if that means that we can save from an ECPI point of view by reducing our accumulation interest rather than a pension interest, or having money sitting in accumulation versus pension, then all those sorts of things need to be taken into consideration. And what we know is that pension payments don't impact the transfer balance account for us. So if we look at a partial commutation, some of the key considerations is that it doesn't count towards the minimum pension after the 1st of July 2017. So we've still got to meet our minimum pension obligation independently. So we've got to have enough money left in the pension to be able to draw down our annual requirement by the 30th of June. It will be a debit to the transfer balance account. So this is what gives us the capacity to create space in the future to put benefits back in. If you're doing partial commutations, again, this is really just an administrative sort of taxing point, but the later in the year that you take lump sum withdrawals, the better it is for ECPI, because from an actuarial point of view, you've got a larger period of time where you've got money sitting in the pension interest, and then when you do your division, and you've got the numerator being the number up the top, the pension number, and the denominator being the entirety of the fund, then I think I've got those right. Maths never been my strong point, but anyway, you've got those two numbers there. You want to make sure that you've got as much in pension for as longer of a period as you can. And again, then from Centrelink point of view, and I raised this earlier in the presentation, the partial commutation piece, might not be of great relevance to those in a post 2015 account-based pension. And therefore, whether you take lump sum or pension is not so relevant there because your income is deemed. But for those with a pre-2015 account-based pension, where where you're operating under a deductible amount versus a deeming amount, then when you take a lump sum out, you get a recalculation of your deductible amount. And so that could have an impact if the fund has grown significantly over time. And I think particularly with the increase in deeming coming sooner rather than later, in my opinion, I think we will have to revisit a lot of these Centrelink issues. But I think that's a conversation for another day. So that's what happens if we take from the pension interest. If we take it from an accumulation interest, then there's not going to be any impact on the transfer balance account. There is going to be a positive impact on the fund ECPI, because we're shrinking the accumulation side of the fund, which enhances the percentage of the fund in pension. And again, as opposed to the opposite of partial commutations from a pension account, by taking it earlier from an accumulation means that we want to, or that we will shrink down that accumulation side much earlier. But is it the best option? And the answer to that is always going to be, as it is in the superannuation environment, that it depends, because we have to actually make the decision. And that's not something that I'm going to stand here and give you the answer to today as to whether you should draw it from the accumulation, the highest taxable percentage, or the highest tax-free percentage pension. I'm going to say that it depends, because is that highest tax-free percentage pension locked away for specific estate planning purposes? Do you want to make sure that that is the maximum amount possible in one instance? If you've got money sitting in accumulation, but that money sitting in accumulation was made with non-concessional contributions or downsizer contributions that have been made and you haven't yet kicked them into pension, then are you better off taking an amount from the higher taxable percentage pension, right? And then getting to maintain and keep those tax-free amounts inside the accumulation interest and potentially lock away another benefit. So each set of circumstances is going to dictate which is right there. But similarly, market conditions will actually dictate what you're going to do in that situation. And we've gone through enough sort of, let's call them financial crisis for one of the conversation piece, is that what we do know about tax-free and taxable is that your tax-free component in the super fund is effectively only locked away at the point that you draw a benefit out. So if you actually make a tax-free contribution to an accumulation interest, all the growth in that accumulation interest is considered taxable. Similarly, all the losses are considered taxable. And so if your losses take your balance below the level of the tax-free contribution, then you effectively have a negative taxable component sitting in your fund. Now, if you don't commence a pension at that point in time, so if you don't lock that interest away, then future growth will go back as taxable and effectively regrow that tax-free component back to its original size. So in that instance, if you've got an accumulation interest, if you've got a high taxable component pension and you've got some accumulation interest with tax-free, you might actually want to potentially commute your taxable pension and put it back in, mixing it with tax-free accumulation to let it dilute some of that taxable component to eventually get the benefit. But that's only going to come in a downward market. In an upward market, you don't want to take that path and you want to just draw money from wherever, but again, probably from the taxable accumulation interest. So all of those sorts of things will come into that decision-making process. And again, what opportunities do you have in the future from making contributions? What opportunities, or what is the existing transfer balance cap position if one member passes away at a point in time? And that in itself leads on to that final concept of reversionary versus discretionary pensions, because I think there's really 2 to 3 elements associated with this. Is one is whether or not the pension will automatically transfer. 2 is what is the other relationships that might impact the decision made by trustees as to whether there is discretion or not. But 3 is how much money and what components do each member have in the fund, that the decision to revert a pension and keep all the money in the super environment is actually going to come back to bite you when you then have to pay a death benefit out when the second member passes away and you have a greater taxable component. And so I think that the whole reversionary versus discretionary is a really, it's a very complex area from a decision-making point of view to determine what's right and what's wrong. And probably wrong's not even the appropriate word there. What is the best outcome? As I said, it is going to be very client specific. And so we need to have an appreciation. So what I wanted to do with the reversionary versus discretionary, before rounding it out with a final example, is really say, okay, well, here's the pros and cons of each, just from my opinion piece on it. But most of these are well supported by others as well in this space, and the way that legislation is operating. So from a reversionary pension point of view, you get your 12-month transfer balance cap grace, right, which again is significant, because what that effectively leads to is 2 times the transfer balance cap, meaning you get that transfer, the exempt current pension income on potentially up to $3.4 million. So if you've both got 1.7 locked away and it reverts, then you know that you've got 12 months before you have to make a decision, and then you're going to get the ECPI for the entirety of that time. So that in itself is very valuable. And for certain funds, that's going to be the only issue. If they've got particularly large assets with large capital gains that they need to sell down to help liquidate things, that can be extremely beneficial. From a valuation certainty point of view, this is where it's a positive in a growth market, it's a negative in a declining market, because if we know what the value is at the date of death and the market's going down, then a reversionary pension is not going to have any interest in what's dropping away, which might actually result in less action being needed from a discretionary point of view with regards to the transfer balance cap, if the transfer balance cap is our driver. But of course, in a growth market, then a reversionary pension is ideal, because it's going to benefit the person in 12 months' time not having to accommodate any of that growth in the rollover process. The minimum pension calculated on the 1st of July, I'll come back and look at that in an example. Again, for most people that pay monthly or regular pension payments, it's not such a significant issue, but with meeting the pension standards, it can be an issue. Counting towards is the spouse's total super balance. That's a significant one for those higher balances, and I'll touch on that. The insurance proceeds not counting towards a transfer balance cap. That's actually a real positive if anyone's still got insurance when they start pensions. And I think that's probably one of the things is I've incorporated insurance, but how many of our clients actually still have insurance by the time they start receiving pensions. From a discretionary point of view, from a positive, there's no pre-death benefit pro rata requirement. So again, unlike the minimum pension being calculated from 1 July that's required to be taken by 30 June for reversionary, the death of a pensioner, if it's discretionary, effectively quashes any requirement to pay the minimum for that year. So that's a benefit. There's no total super benefit, total super balance impact until that new pension's commenced. So again, if the timing of things can actually provide additional contribution strategic opportunities for clients. The valuation uncertainty. So again, exactly the same as reversionary. A growth market, terrible for discretionary pensions. A declining market is really good. Now, the thing is, we've got to make these decisions early on, but then at least what we can factor in is, okay, well, you know, the concept behind discretionary, and this is why I often take the view that discretionary pensions are potentially a better place to be than reversionary, is that if we know the markets are increasing, then we start that new pension from the day after death, or the day after the death date. So we actually don't have a huge valuation impact, right? And we can have the process in place to have those conversations with trustees to say, this is what we're going to do. So to me, there are ways around that. The insurance proceed does count towards the transfer balance cap, because the money's got to come in before you commence that new pension. So that's going to be potentially problematic. And then you do have your transfer balance cap time sensitivities to be mindful of there. You don't have that 12-month window like you do in the other situations. So it's certainly one that you need to be mindful of, which is what leads into that final point. So let's finish off by going through an example from a reversion versus non-reversion. So we've got Anna, who's age 71 and dies on the 1st of March 2022. Balance at 1 July last year was 2 million. Balance at death was $2.1 million. Minimum with the 50% reduction is 50,000, paid annually in June. Spouse 66 with $450,000. So not uncommon, and not uncommon for Anna to be the dominant member of the fund and also the decision maker, knows that it pays a pension. The spouse is maybe not so tuned into things and doesn't always pay attention to what their obligations are. So how does this translate? If we look at it from a reversionary pension point of view, then the spouse gets that credit of $2.1 million on the transfer balance account on the 1st of March 2023. At the 30th of June 2022, however, the spouse's total super balance at age 66 is now $2.55 million, because the pension has reverted from March 2022. So that knocks out any opportunities really to make any sort of contribution other than downsizer following 30 June 2022. If there was a failure to pay the minimum in June, it would result in a loss of the exempt current pension income on that full $2.1 million. So if they've sold down any assets or whatever, that could definitely be problematic. If we look at it from a discretionary pension point of view, but if we go back, of course, the pros of that is that we don't have to do too much. If the income has been paid regularly, and if there's no desire or anything to make more contributions, then so be it. It gives us absolute certainty, so there's no real issue to contemplate. From a discretionary point of view, again, we've got 1 March as the date of death.
What day do we start the pension? Well, as soon as practical, can certainly be in the next financial year. There's no issue there. We're going to credit the transfer balance cap with whatever the value is at that date. So that is the uncertainty. That's the unknown. So it's a bit of an amber light there. From the 30 June 2022, unlike the 2.5 million before, the spouse's total super balance is $450,000. So that gives them that capacity to maybe use, they're under 66 next year when the rules change about the work test in 67, they could potentially use the carry forward concessional. They can definitely look at recontribution strategies and potentially draw some of that $2.1 million out and put it back into the fund as a non-concessional for themselves and start tax-free pensions to then go on and pay tax-free benefits to adult children in the future. And they would get the full ECPI because there's no minimum pension obligation to be paid for the entirety of that year when that member has passed away. So they'll get the full ECPI for that year, even if the fund doesn't pay the pension in June, unlike the reversionary pension. So there's pros and cons for each. So if I summarize all of this for you, then I go back to those original questions. A TRIS, what is their relevance post 1 July? Well, for me, there's no reason not to consider it as a viable strategy because it gives us, one, that opportunity to segregate the tax-free and taxable components, but also the non-assessable income. Multiple pensions, what role do they have to play? Again, estate planning is probably the most significant role they have to play, but also we can look at the whole the failing of the pension standards and making sure that we maintain some exempt income in the fund. Lump sums versus pension, always going to be a case-by-case scenario, but we can consider it with regards to estate planning, transfer balance cap, exempt current pension income, and certainly social security benefits as well. And then the last one being the reversionary versus discretionary. And I come back to my very early opening point, which is that one size definitely doesn't fit all. And so for some plain vanilla self-managed superannuation funds where there's no other potential beneficiaries, then a discretionary pension generally serves us exactly the same purpose as a reversionary pension. But the reversionary pension can provide a lot more certainty in some circumstances when clients need it, because maybe there's a 6-member fund or there's other beneficiaries sniffing around and you want to make sure that one person receives the benefit. So look, as I said, that was a quick fire rapid introduction to the pension toolkit and all the questions that we really need to be asking ourselves and therefore asking of our clients when setting these pensions up. I hope that you get some good takeaway points from it. My next webinar is the 6th of July, and I'm basically going to go through the concept there, are your SMSFs audit and future-proof, really looking at, okay, we're ending the financial year, market valuations, the whole concept around ECPI for pension funds and what the new rules that apply this year mean, which method you're going to use, a whole heap of other sorts of areas that we're going to be delving into in that webinar. So thanks for attending today. As always, you'll get a copy of the slides sent through to you with your CPD. No questions, so either I've totally baffled everybody or I've just reconfirmed a lot of information for you. You can always contact me afterwards. Thanks for attending, and I look forward to speaking to you all in July.